3HP among adults as well as in children. So I'll be sharing this presentation with Nicole, who will be focused on the children, but I will be talking about the adults first. So I'll be going through the, it's not advancing.
This is what I do before.
I'll be presenting some background, expressing some anger around what has not happened, applauding some of the progress that has been made, and then providing the evidence for action with respect to 3HP and some of the other regimens, and concluding. So starting with the background, the WHO NTB strategy calls on us to implement existing tools and strategies to start moving towards ending the epidemic, while developing new tools that we can then scale up to end TB. We currently have those tools at our disposal, which includes the use of TB preventive therapy. The WHO has identified 2 high-risk groups to target preventive therapy to. First, people living with HIV who are at increased risk of developing TB, and child contacts less than 5 years of age. Subsequent to this, these initial recommendations, WHO has issued additional guidelines and expanded these recommendations, and I'll come back to that later. Mathematical modeling suggests that scaling up new tools can impact on the epidemic. And just to point out that scaling up TB preventive therapy, shown here, with or without vaccines, has the best likelihood of having impact. In fact, scaling up preventive therapy is the single most efficacious regimen or intervention for impacting on the epidemic. Now, expressing some anger about lack of progress. So although isoniazid is cheap, it's effective, it's safe, and yet it has not been scaled up in high-burden countries. Shown on the top dotted line are the total number of people living with HIV in need of preventive therapy. This dashed line here at the bottom represents uptake of ARVs, and down here at the bottom is the uptake of preventive therapy, really indicating how woeful the uptake of preventive therapy has been. And there are many reasons for this poor uptake, and we are hoping that 3HP will be a game changer and address many of these challenges to the uptake of preventive therapy. Only 68 countries have reported starting now over 1 million people on IPT to WHO, and the number of countries reporting on treatment completion is 0, and very little information up until recently has been reported to WHO for child contacts. The recent meta-analysis by Dick Menzies on the cascade of preventive therapy shows that from the number of people in need to those that are initiated and completing treatment, only about 20% of individuals actually start and then complete treatment. So again, this is very, very poor. The biggest gap, of course, is amongst those that are in need, have been tested and then started on treatment, and then a big fall off once they initiate treatment and then completing treatment. Dick Chasen, in his editorial following the results of the Temprano trial, called on an end to preventive therapy denialism, which he equated to the AIDS denialism that costs 330,000 lives in South Africa due to the failure to scale up antiretroviral therapy. But we do need to applaud the progress that has been made. And I've already shown you this graph, although you won't recognize it. This is the very bottom series of lines you saw in that graph when I showed you the total number of people living with HIV in need of preventive therapy. But just to point out that the initial catalytic scale-up was with South Africa, which prompted uptake largely in Africa and now the rest of the world occurring. And it is encouraging that we are now starting close to 1 million people per year on preventive therapy. But as I mentioned before, this is really pitiful in terms of the total number of people in need. We need to applaud WHO for issuing the revised integrated guidelines for the programmatic management of TB infection. And this now includes adults and children living with HIV, HIV-negative adult and child contacts, and other HIV negatives at high risk of developing TB. Included in the recommendations is now the recommendation for the high-dose rifampicin and isoniazid weekly for 3 months. That's the 3HP regimen, as well as daily isoniazid and rifampicin, that's in standard doses, for 3 months, and for child and adolescents less than 15 years of age. Now, what about the evidence for action, starting with 3HP? So the IMPAACT4TB project you will have heard about today, but IMPAACT4TB stands for Increased Market and Public Health Outcomes to Scaling Up Affordable Access Models of Short-Course Preventive Therapy for TB. We see 3HP as a potential game changer, one because WHO has prioritized it now for scaling up and as part of the NTB strategy, but it's shorter, less toxic, associated with better adherence, has a higher barrier to resistance, and has similar efficacy to isoniazid preventive therapy, and is less burden to health programs to implement, and safe with EFV-based regimens. I'll come back to the issue of cost and giving it with dolutegravir. So I'll now provide the evidence for those various statements and take you through that step by step. So the first efficacy data for 3HP was done by Study 26. This is by the CDC TB Clinical Trials Consortium, conducted in countries that were middle or low burden countries. And what it showed was that a single round of 3HP in individuals 2 years and older, in comparison to 9 months of isoniazid, was non-inferior. So this was a non-inferiority trial, and there was this trend towards superiority with 3HP. Of the almost 8,000 individuals enrolled, there was underrepresentation of people living with HIV and child contacts. And so the CDC enrolled additional or expanded enrollment of HIV-infected individuals, and they showed very similar results to the main trial. And they again showed similar efficacy to 9 months of INH, higher treatment completion rates, similar treatment limiting adverse events, and less hepatotoxicity amongst people living with HIV. And amongst children, similarly, they found that there was similar efficacy, that the treatment completion rates were better, and that the adherence was better. In the post-marketing surveillance in the United States, when they then moved into programmatic scale-up, so it's Christine Ho here. Christine was responsible for leading this initiative, and they found that in the over 3,000 individuals they started on 3HP under programmatic conditions, that the treatment completion rates were also very high, and that the adverse event rate was similar to that they documented in the Study 26, or the Prevent TB study. Another study was conducted in Soweto in South Africa, led by Professor Dick Chasen and Neil Martinson, where they compared novel regimens to 6 months of INH, and it included lifelong isoniazid preventive therapy. And what they showed was that a single round of 3HP, shown in the blue line, had similar efficacy to the 6 months of INH as well as a lifelong IPT. There have been 2 systematic reviews of 3HP looking at safety as well as treatment completion. The first looked at 15 studies that had been randomized, and they showed similar effectiveness to other regimens, but much higher treatment completion rates with 3HP. And they noted that the treatment completion rates were similar whether the 3HP was taken as directly observed or self-administered. And then the adverse event rates were lower with 3HP, as was discontinuing treatment because of adverse events. The death rates, however, was similar. The second systematic review included observational studies, and so they had many more studies included in their meta-analysis. And the results, however, were similar, with the rate of any adverse event for 3HP being lower than that for the other regimens. Withdrawals due to adverse events, again, was lower. Flu-like reactions, however, was higher with 3HP compared to INH. And hepatotoxicity, along with the 4R regimen, was substantially lower than the INH-based regimens. A study was conducted looking at the cost effectiveness of 3HP versus IPT using Uganda as a model country. And what it showed was 3HP could be cost effectiveness depending on willingness to pay and the prevalence of latent TB infection and the completion rates of the preventive therapy. But really, the take-home message is that if we can get the price of rifampicin down to $20 per course or less, that it would be cost-effective, and below that would potentially be cost-saving. So the goals of the IMPACT4TB project are to reduce TB incidence and deaths amongst people living with HIV and child contacts through scaling up affordable, quality-assured 3HP by increasing the numbers of people living with HIV and child contacts starting 3HP. We are all aware of the study done by NIH that was interrupted after 4 participants were enrolled due to hypersensitivity reactions with dolutegravir and 3HP. And so this is an important consideration, but we need to just be mindful that rifamycins are likely to be an important part of first-line TB treatment for some time to come, and that the rifamycins are all potent inducers of liver metabolizing enzymes and drug transport proteins. The inspiring trial led by Kelly Dooley looked at the interaction between dolutegravir versus EFV-based ART in TB HIV patients taking the first-line TB treatment. And in this study, they documented and reported at CROI this year that the dose of dolutegravir will need to be doubled to ensure an effective dose of dolutegravir. The subsequent follow-on study going out to 96 weeks will be reported shortly, but again, just confirming these results. So just to spend some time talking you through the information from the NIH study that enrolled healthy volunteers, and it started them on dolutegravir, and then they were given 3 doses of the 3HP regimen, and then they had intensive PK studies done. And what they found was that after 4 patients had been enrolled, 2 developed the severe hypersensitivity reactions, and the study was stopped on this basis. And because of these results, we were then asked within the IMPACT4TB project to redesign the project and to do a safety and PK study amongst people living with HIV now, not healthy volunteers, but people living with HIV, to see and document whether it was safe and effective, and whether we needed to alter the dose of dolutegravir or not. When they looked at the dose of dolutegravir in these 4 participants, they found that the level of dolutegravir decreased by 75%. So there was a very large reduction in the dose, the levels of dolutegravir. But even though it was so markedly reduced, the levels still remained 5-fold higher than the clinically effective dose required for dolutegravir. So that was reassuring. Then after the third dose, the levels seemed to drift back up again. We will be looking at this within our trial as well. They looked at what were the markers of inflammation, and they found that in the 2 patients that developed the hypersensitivity reaction, that the markers of inflammation were all increased, suggesting that there was an inflammatory basis to this hypersensitivity reaction. But when they looked at the levels of rifampicin and isoniazid in these patients, in all patients, the level of rifampicin was within the normal range, so that was not changed. What was changed was that amongst patients that were on with the INH component, in the 2 patients that had the hypersensitivity reaction, the levels of INH had gone up. So that was an unexpected finding, and we'll be looking at the levels of both rifampicin and INH in our study to see what is happening when we couple this with dolutegravir. So this is the trial that we are conducting. It's called the Dolphin study, and its purpose is to evaluate the effect of rifampicin and INH on dolutegravir PK, and to assess the safety of 3-HP when given with dolutegravir, and to determine the optimal dosage of dolutegravir with 3-HP, and to estimate the proportion maintaining virologically suppressed, and to describe the PK of INH and rifampicin with dolutegravir. So we have completed enrollment of Group 1A, where we did the semi-intensive PK at baseline, and then following the 2 doses. And as I say, this has been completed, and we've already had the Independent Safety and Monitoring Committee review all this data and make recommendations on continuing and on the dose of dolutegravir. In Group 1B, we've used the data from Group 1A to select the dose of dolutegravir going forward, and we have completely enrolled Group 1B, and we are now getting to the point where these patients here will all have completed this semi-intensive PK phase. And then as soon as this has been done for all the patients in Group 1B, and there's 18 of them, we'll then conduct our second interim analysis to look at the PK aspects as well as safety again. Then for Group 2, here we have also completed enrollment into Group 2, and they are in the process of being followed up, but here we are a bit further back. And we'll then finish the full follow-up of Group 2 patients by the end of January next year, and have results in February. Study TBTC Study 35 is another PK study which is being co-funded by IMPAACT4TB as well as the TB Clinical Trials Consortium, and this is to evaluate it's a phase 1/2 dose finding and safety study of rifampicin and INH in HIV-infected and HIV-uninfected children with TB infection. And the initial PK work done from Study 26, which looked at children down to the age of 2 years, suggests that the dose of rifampicin required to achieve the same exposure that we see in adults given a 15 milligram per kilogram dose is higher the younger the child is. And so the hypothesis of the Study 35 is that rifampicin given as a water dispersible tablet, or FDC, with isoniazid in HIV-infected and uninfected children less than 12 years of age with TB infection or with TB exposure will require higher doses of rifampicin than adults to achieve the same adult exposure, and then that it will be safe and well tolerated. This study is likely to start hopefully early next year, and it will take a year to complete. And I want to move on to what is the evidence for whether preventive therapy does or does not generate resistance. So this is a commonly heard concern for not scaling up TB preventive therapy. So let me first give you the key take-home message, and then I'll provide the evidence for that. So preventive therapy does not generate resistance. In interpreting the results, you need to bear in mind certain aspects. Now, this is quite complex to get around, so I'll try to explain it simply. If we take 10 individuals as an example who are infected with TB, one of which has a strain of TB that is resistant to INH. So here the prevalence of TB infection that is INH resistant is 10%. And we give this group isoniazid preventive therapy, and this group get a placebo. Because the isoniazid preventive therapy is effective, it suppresses, it prevents the emergence of drug-susceptible TB, but it does not influence the emergence of the INH-resistant TB. So this INH-resistant TB was going to emerge whether you gave the treatment or not. Where in the control group, because there's no influence on the proportion of cases that are drug susceptible that progress to TB, and similarly you haven't influenced the INH resistant TB, the proportion that are resistant when you've given isoniazid preventive therapy, and because it's effective, so this is an example just to remind you, 50% would be INH resistant, where in the control group where you didn't give them anything or you gave them placebo, 25% of the active TB cases would have INH resistant. In this scenario, you're not generating INH resistance. What you are doing is you're unmasking INH resistance. You're not generating additional resistance. And the way to think about this is, so as a proportion of all TB cases, if the preventive therapy is working, you would expect to see a high proportion of INH-resistant cases, simply because the preventive therapy has worked. If it wasn't working, you would see this. But when you look at it with respect to incident TB cases, because you're not influencing this, the incidence between the two is the same. So in this example, 10% and 10%, where the prevalence of INH resistance of those that develop TB cases is twice that in the group that got INH preventive therapy versus the controls. So I know that conceptually this is a bit of a challenge, but you need to understand this when trying to defend why preventive therapy doesn't generate resistance and when interpreting the data. So now looking at the evidence for whether preventive therapy generates resistance or not, starting with isoniazid preventive therapy, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at all published data since 1951, and they had a large number of individuals, so this was almost 40,000 individuals in this meta-analysis with 13 studies, and what they found was that although the confidence intervals are wide, that there is no evidence that INH generates resistance. So these results were similar when stratified by HIV, and as I said, no evidence that INH generates resistance. This meta-analysis was updated recently in 2014, but no additional studies at that time in 2014 were found. However, subsequent to that meta-analysis, there have been now a series of additional trials that have used isoniazid preventive therapy, and I'll talk about some of them in my subsequent slides. So that would further add evidence, but basically in those trials, again, there was no evidence that isoniazid preventive therapy was generating resistance. To try and disentangle this issue between proportion of TB cases with INH resistance, so a prevalence versus incidence of INH resistance, In the Big Tabela TB project, where we started 27,500 gold miners on isoniazid preventive therapy as part of a trial to evaluate community-wide isoniazid preventive therapy, we compared patients or miners who got TB after receiving IPT to comparison groups. These were individuals in the control shafts or control mines who didn't get IPT, as well as individuals enrolled into the laboratory sub-study who didn't get IPT. And we looked at this for individuals with a first episode of TB, as well as retreatment episodes of TB. And for both the first and retreatment episodes of TB, there's no evidence that having given the preventive therapy is generating any additional risk of generating isoniazid resistance, looking at incidence. Now looking at the evidence for rifampicin-based regimens. So this was a recent systematic review also done in 2014 and published in 2016. And they looked at 6 randomized controlled trials of rifampicin-based TB preventive therapy versus active control or placebo. And what they found is that, and here there is an error, Dick Chasen pointed out to us, an error in this data, but they were in the rifampicin, in those that received a rifamycin-based TB preventive therapy, there were 6 cases of rifampicin-resistant cases amongst almost 7,000. And in the those that received alternative regimens, there was 1 case. And so, although that relative risk seems high, their confidence intervals are broad and overlapping, and again, the p-value does not suggest any significant association with generating resistance. They then restricted this analysis to look at individuals that got the intermittent rifamycin-based TB preventive therapy. And here there were 3 cases of rifampicin resistance in almost 5,000 individuals on those containing a rifamycin-based regimen. And this is where the mistake was. In the published paper, there was 1 case of rifamycin resistance in the almost 4,500 individuals on control regimens. Again, no evidence of rifampicin or rifamycin-based regimens generating resistance. There were 2 studies that compared rifamycin-based TB preventive therapy to placebo, and just to cut to the chase, again, no evidence compared to placebo. In fact, there again, compared to placebo, the rifamycin-based regimens seem to be protective, but very broad confidence intervals, and the take-home message is the same. Rifamycin regimens don't generate resistance. So just to summarize, TB preventive therapy does not promote resistance as long as active TB is excluded. The TB-infected persons have few organisms that divide slowly, and hence there's a low risk of selecting for drug resistance. And most resistance arises from suboptimal treatment of active disease, or as we now know, transmission from someone who has drug-resistant TB to others. And so preventing active disease may be beneficial for reducing the overall prevalence of resistance. We do, however, need to have ongoing surveillance for resistance. So what is the evidence for action for some of the other regimens that have been studied? I'll start with the WIP3TB trial that you've already heard about today. This is a randomized pragmatic open-label trial to evaluate given 3-HP once versus annually amongst HIV-infected individuals. And in this study, we have 3 arms, 1 arm getting 6 months of isoniazid followed for a year, and then 2 arms getting 3-HP either once or annually followed for 2 years. And in the part A of the analysis, we're comparing the 2 3-HP regimens or arms combined to the 6H arm as an observational cohort study. And then in the second analysis, part B, we're comparing the 3-HP given once to the 3-HP given annually. This trial completed enrollment and will be finishing the final follow-up by this time next year. Then you also would have heard during the course of today about the brief TB trial, which evaluated 1 month of daily standard dose isoniazid and rifampicin amongst people living with HIV in 51 sites in 16 countries, ranging from middle to high burden countries. And what they found was that 1HP was non-inferior to 9 months of isoniazid, but that it had better safety, tolerability, and treatment completion. But the issue of cost then comes to the fore, and it is 1.6-fold more expensive than 3HP. So even though you're giving it only for 1 month, because you're taking the treatment daily, the actual exposure to rifampicin is much greater than for 3HP. So the cost is a big issue. We don't know whether we'll have to dose adjust for dolutegravir, and there's a study being done by the ACTG to compare dolutegravir and TAF with once daily or twice daily dolutegravir. But there's no evidence to support use in HIV-uninfected persons, children, and pregnant women. And I'm now aware of 3 trials which have been submitted for funding to generate evidence for these subpopulations. Then looking at isoniazid preventive therapy, so although it was done with isoniazid preventive therapy, what's important is that it really underscores the role of preventive therapy with antiretroviral therapy. The first trial was done in Cape Town, South Africa, that gave 12 months of isoniazid preventive therapy to patients on antiretroviral therapy and showed a almost 40% reduction in the risk of TB, but death rates were similar. So this was the first randomized evidence for the benefits of IPT or preventive therapy with antiretroviral therapy. It was followed by the Temprano trial, which was done in Côte d'Ivoire and Abidjan, and they showed that 6 months of isoniazid preventive therapy with immediate antiretroviral therapy reduced both the risk of TB and deaths, and that this benefit accrued to individuals regardless of their CD4 count, including those with high CD4 counts above 500. The third randomized trial that looked at the benefits of preventive therapy with antiretroviral therapy was the enhanced prophylaxis trial done in high burden countries, also published in the NEJM last year. And again, they showed that the benefits of IPT also reduced the risk of TB and deaths in patients with advanced HIV disease. All these individuals had CD4 counts less than 100. The next 2 trials have recently been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they evaluated 4 months of daily rifampicin compared to 9 months of isoniazid in TB-infected individuals, ranging in middle to low burden settings. And they enrolled almost 3,500 adults. And they showed that 4 months of rifampicin was non-inferior to 9 months of isoniazid, that it had better safety, similar to what we've observed with 3HP, and higher treatment completion rates. And they conducted a similar trial amongst children, where they enrolled children less than 18 years of age, and again showed treatment completion rates were higher, adverse event rates were similar and low, and treatment efficacy was similar to 9 months of isoniazid. The TB APPRISE trial evaluated giving isoniazid preventive therapy to pregnant women, because we know that pregnant women are at increased risk of developing TB, and that has adverse outcomes for the mother, as well as the pregnancy outcomes and infants. And to our surprise, this study was associated, by giving IPT during pregnancy, was associated with a higher risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, low birth weights, and fetal demise. And because of this, it's no longer recommended to give pregnant women isoniazid preventive therapy. But the good news is that the maternal and infant TB rates were low in both immediate and deferred IPT arms. So it's safe to defer the preventive therapy until after pregnancy, and then avert these poor adverse outcomes that we saw in the infants. So in conclusion, managing the global burden of LTBI is essential to meeting the NTB targets. People living with HIV and child contacts are at high risk of developing TB, and INH is cheap and effective, yet IPT uptake is in high burden settings remains very low, and that 3HP as a short course TB preventive therapy is associated with better adherence and safety, and that by scaling this up, we feel we can achieve and accelerate progress towards ending the TB epidemic. But we are going to need to implement market interventions to help us reduce the price of 3HP, to make it affordable for countries to implement. And I think I may have skipped over it previously, but the new WHO guidelines need to be implemented. It's now recommending 3HP in high burden countries, and that the IMPAACT4TB project will catalyze 3HP scale up and work in partnership with groups such as PEPFAR and Global Fund to transition this into sustainable scale up. But the good news is that even though 3HP is a great innovation and will hopefully be a game changer, there's even more innovation that will come in the years to follow, where we're looking at even shorter, more potent regimens than what we currently have. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions, or should we do Nicole first?
Thank you very much for such a comprehensive review of the evidence around this very important topic. I'm interested to know the dosing that was used for children, and, because it's recommended for 2 years and above. What dose of rifampicin, rifamycin, what dose of IMPAACT was used in milligrams per kg body weight, and then for the RH, there was a 4R study that you shared. What dose of the rifampicin was used?
So 4R is rifampicin, not rifampicin.
What dose was used for the prophylaxis in that particular study?
So I'm going to have to ask Nicole to help me here. So for the study 26, they were using weight-banded dosing. So I can't remember exactly what dose was required for which weight bands. Can you?
I don't know if I remember the weight bands, but they were in 150 milligram increments for the rifampicin. So 150, 300, 450, 600. And then it maxed out at the adult dose of 900. And then for the 4R study, they would use going back to 3HP, the dose of INH was 25 mg per kg.
Yeah,
so it was higher than the, so that the dose was higher also in children. So the normal treatment dose for both prevention and treatment with INH is 15 mg per kg, but for 3HP, similar to adults, it's higher. It's 25 mg per kg.
So would the rifampicin have been double that, or would it have been similar, 25 milligrams? Was it 150 and 150, or 300 and 300 of the two drugs? Children.
I'd have to do out the math. It probably wasn't exactly the same.
I've got it. I'll call it up on my laptop and show you.
Okay, and actually for the 1 month of the 1
HP.
1 HP.
Yeah, was it the 900 milligrams every day?
No. I think we would kill patients if we did. No, that's standard dose with a pentin and isoniazid. So 300 milligrams of isoniazid, 600 milligrams of rifampicin, depending on the weight band, because it was also weight banded. What I haven't got in here, and I should actually put in, is that the WHO guidelines currently still recommend weight-banded dosing for rifampicin. But there's clear evidence that the metabolism of rifampicin is independent of weight. And so we can actually use a flat dose of rifampicin. And so for TB treatment now, there's a study 31 that's underway with high-dose rifapentine for treatment shortening, and they are using a flat dose of 1,200 milligrams, so regardless of weight in adults. And we are going to be providing the evidence to WHO to change the guidelines for 3HP such that it's also for adults a flat dose of rifapentine. You won't need to dose adjust for people that are below the age of below the weight of 50. Karen, there's someone.
So just one last question. The children, the 2 up to 6 year olds, what was your experience in terms of the acceptability, palatability? Were they taking them well? Were they crushing and throwing? Did they like the taste?
So in study 26, as I mentioned, that was done in Latin America, Canada, the United States, Spain, I think it was. So developed countries, basically. They were crushing the tablets, but examples from high burden countries we have from Pakistan, where they've been rolling out as part of the Zero Cities initiative, and they started with household contacts. And so they offer 3HP to children, and what they found is that even fairly small children, down to the age of 5 or even below, have managed to take the tablets, one of the tablets. But where they can't, they crush the tablets. Acceptance in the children from the Pakistan experience seems to be very high. They really haven't had a problem with children accepting this. We also have experience in the WIP3TB trial. 2 of our sites enrolled children. We allowed that in the protocol, but unfortunately not many. And similarly, among the few children we enrolled, there were no problems with the children managing to take the 3HP. But we are waiting for the dispersible fixed dose combination tablets, as well as so Sanofi have developed a dispersible FDC plus a dispersible single rifapentine, because we may need to supplement the dose of rifapentine in the children less than 2 years of age. But that's going to be evaluated in study 35. And so as soon as we have those results, we'll be able to start using that. Well, it will have to first get registered, of course, but at least then we have a product that is going to be coming into the clinic pretty shortly. Yes, someone at the back wanted a question.
Yes, this is Lawrence from Lawrence. I just wanted to find out.
Sorry, who's speaking?
Lawrence from
there you are. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I see that most of the clinical trials involving participants that are tested for TB, for latent TB, whether by the GI or the multi test. What is your recommendation for countries that are resourced and not afford to do the GI testing for
Yeah, so thanks for asking that important question. So a lot of the clinical trials, but not all, did include a test of infection, and that's because the trials are always designed to maximize efficacy. So that's what they're wanting to show. From a programmatic perspective, WHO no longer requires the testing for people living with HIV and child contacts less than 5. So that's clear. And the reason for that is that their risk is so high and that they benefit from preventive therapy. Also, what was shown in the first study I showed you that was done in Cape Town of IPT with antiretroviral therapy, and again in the Temprano trial, was that even individuals on antiretroviral therapy that had a negative either skin test or test of infection, whether it was a skin test or an IGRA, benefited from preventive therapy. And you may ask, well, why is that when in before a negative test of infection was associated with no evidence of efficacy? And part of the reason we think is that a lot of people with HIV are infected. We know from the work that's been done in Cape Town and elsewhere that in high transmission settings, by the time people become young adults, a large proportion, and in places like South Africa, the vast majority of people are infected with TB. And that's not going to be different if you're HIV infected or uninfected. And why we were seeing a very low prevalence in HIV-infected before antiretroviral therapy became available is that people had allergy. Now that they are on antiretroviral therapy,